Hello, this is the Tivana course, Standards for Free and Fair Elections. My name is Andrew Blick. I am lecturer in Politics and Contemporary History and Director of History and Policy, King's College London. I was also Research Fellow to the first ever parliamentary inquiry in the United Kingdom, my country, into whether or not we should adopt a written constitution. I specialise in constitutional history and the history of democratic development in the UK and elsewhere, and I've also worked with a number of democratic assessment and reform groups based in countries around the world, including Pakistan, Ukraine and Turkey. Please watch this lecture before the live discussion session. Also, after the lecture and in advance of the session, as required reading, please read the Venice Commission report on the rule of law from 2011. It's available online to download. This lecture will talk about the key principles which underpin democratic elections. It will provide students with an understanding of various important issues, including the idea of universal political equality, the importance of freedom of expression, association and assembly, the importance of the rule of law, the importance of freedom from intimidation, and finally the significant part played by political accountability in ensuring that elections are genuinely democratic in their nature. When we talk about the key principles of democratic elections, and this is a theme that's occurred in all our lectures so far, but obviously what's very important is the elections have to have meaningful consequences. Put crudely, they have to potentially lead to some people losing their jobs and other people getting those jobs. They have to potentially lead to changes in who holds power. They have to change, therefore, not only who holds power, but also the people who hold power have to then be able to do something with the power they've acquired and deliver the promises they've made to voters. That's a fundamental point. There's also some other very important principles. Elections should take place at appropriate intervals. There should not be excessively long gaps between one election and the next. A common norm often in democratic societies is around about the 4-year mark. Doesn't always work that way, and there are different ways in which you can trigger elections. Sometimes institutions aren't all elected in one go. They may be elected in portions at 2-yearly intervals, for instance. But whatever happens, there shouldn't be an excessively long period between one election and the next. Voters need to have a chance to actually hold those they've elected to account at another election in the future. That's crucial. There should also be some kind of mechanism for triggering early elections. Often there is. There shouldn't necessarily be an excessively rigid timetable. There should be clear rules in place around when elections take place, but there should be a mechanism, if need be, if there's a real problem, a breakdown, or a kind of deadlock between different groups in an elected institution, there may be a need for an early election, and there should be some kind of provision for that to take place. At the same time, it should be very clearly defined so it can't be abused. Because alongside the problem of the gaps between elections being too long, there's also a potential problem of excessively frequent elections, and also a problem of a party in a position of power abusing that power to force an early general election that it thinks it can exploit for some reason. So there need to be clear rules there, but the underlying principle is there has to be fairly frequent elections. We get on to another absolutely critical point, and this ties into the wider conception of democracy that I've been talking about in previous lectures. Clearly, the holding of elections is essential, perhaps even the defining feature of democracy. But for elections to be meaningful, they have to take place within a wider democratic system and a wider democratic culture. And part of that wider democratic culture is there has to be a system of fundamental rights or human rights in place, certain basic principles that recognise the inherent value of every human being, the idea that on some level we are all equals and we have the same set of rights that we're able to assert on our own behalf and we're required to recognise in others. Without this system of rights in place, elections become less meaningful as actual exercises in democracy. So one crucial political right is this idea of non-discrimination, of equality, that people are equal, that people cannot have the vote taken away from them on unfair grounds, for instance, on the basis of their gender or on a basis of their ethnicity, as has happened in countries in the past, or on a basis of their religious adherence. So that's an important quality that has to be firmly in place if democratic elections are actually going to be meaningful. There are other rights as well, that the absence of which would clearly undermine the democratic effectiveness of elections. For instance, the right to freedom of expression. If people don't have a right to express particular views, how can a meaningful democratic election take place? The candidates would not necessarily be allowed to put over what were their actual policies to the public, and campaigners would not be able to voice particular views during the election campaign. The election campaign would clearly be seriously compromised if there were arbitrary and unreasonable restrictions on freedom of expression, because without genuine debate, without genuine discussion of ideas, of policies, of proposals, of what is going on in the country and in the world, you can't have a proper election process. Another right which needs to be firmly protected if elections are going to be meaningful is freedom of association, which can mean, after all, freedom of membership of a particular party. If a party doesn't have freedom to associate, and if people don't have freedom to join that party, it can't really take part in an election in a proper way. And that goes to the heart, again, of the meaning of elections, these core principles that elections have to actually be a meaningful competition. If you're effectively stopping certain parties from associating, you're not having a fully competitive election. And that's obviously a democratic problem. Another example of a human right which is crucial to an election and to making an election democratic is freedom of assembly. If there's no freedom of assembly, it's hard for people to gather together and actually discuss elections, take part in election rallies, take part in election campaigning, if they don't have a freedom of assembly. So all those kinds of rights are absolutely critical to ensuring that meaningful democratic elections can take place. This also takes us to a possibly even more fundamental feature of democracy, and that's a thing called the rule of law. Rule of law means you have a clearly established system of social rules, laws, that apply throughout the society. They apply to everybody. They apply to the governed, but also to the governors. They mean that we are all subject to the same basic principles and rules. If the rule of law is going to be effective, certain conditions must be fulfilled. First of all, we have to be able to know what those rules are. This is critical, and this will come back again and again in relation to elections. There has to be a clearly defined set of rules. This applies to the rule of law in generally, and it certainly applies to elections. You have to know what the rules applying to elections are. If there are certain limitations in relation to elections, they might be necessary, but it's important that everybody is clear about what those limitations are, that they're clearly defined. Another very important principle of the rule of law is that everybody should have access to the law. The law should not be the property of one particular privileged elite group. It should belong to everybody. And if people have an objection, have a complaint, feel that in some way they have been abused contrary to the law, they should have some kind of potential for recourse. Therefore, access is absolutely critical. This leads on to another core principle of the rule of law, namely that the rule of law should be applied impartially. In other words, everybody has the right to the same kind of treatment under the law. If the rules have been broken in application to one particular person, whoever they are, they should have the right to some kind of redress. So the law, again, is not the property of one particular privileged group, it's the property of everybody, and everybody is entitled to the same degree of protection. And the way you achieve this is by administering the law impartially. And certainly this applies in the case of elections, that if people have some kind of complaint, that complaint has to be dealt with impartially in relation to the election process. An important connected feature of that is that the judiciary should be independent. The judiciary should not be subordinate to, say, a governing group or a governing party. They should actually be able to stand apart from the different interests in society and actually look at the law and apply the law. Finally, when we look at the rule of law, which, as I say, is absolutely crucial to a meaningful, properly functioning electoral system, we have to take into account that the way in which the law is formed. The law cannot be formed in an arbitrary way. It should be formed in a way which is considered. It shouldn't simply be changed very easily without actual proper procedures. The law should be formed in accordance with procedures and with respect to some of the principles I've already talked about. And preferably it should be formed in an inclusive way. In other words, the democratic system should feed into the legal system, and laws should be formed by bodies which are preferably in some way democratically accountable. So we can see there's a kind of virtuous circle here. The rule of law guarantees that elections are held in a fair way, that elections are not hijacked by a particular group, that the electoral process works to the benefit of everybody, and in turn those elections can lead to the elections of bodies, of legislatures, which themselves issue laws which become more broadly based because they're linked to the democratic process. So all of those issues are critical if we're going to understand how an election process needs to function, and the fact that it needs to be in accordance with the rule of law. And here the readings which are provided should be useful in underpinning some of those core features of the rule of law. Connected to that is that the rule of law has to apply, law has to be upheld throughout the territory, and a very important feature of that is that there should be freedom from intimidation. People should not be subject to intimidation in the way in which they vote, in the way in which they campaign, in the way in which they run for election. They need to be able to cast their vote freely without fear of the consequences. And again, upholding the rule of law is important here, because there clearly needs to be prescription of intimidation in the law, and that law needs to be upheld. And if it's violated, people need to be able to complain about that violation, they need to be able to seek redress, and they need the courts impartially to look at the case and properly apply the law in those instances. A final point I'm going to talk about in the lecture today is another underpinning principle of democratic elections, namely political accountability. This point is important because it means that in between one election and the next, people have to have a way of being aware what those people they have elected are actually doing on their behalf. And this is where the whole idea of accountability comes into play. One form of accountability is through voting, that you actually vote for people or don't vote for people on a basis of how well you feel they've already performed since they were last elected. So you get that kind of accountability through an election. But that kind of accountability, that opportunity for accountability through election, may only come along once every 4 to 5 years. And even when it does come along, how do you know how well that person has been performing? How do you decide which way to cast your vote? Well, that's where the wider conception of political accountability comes into play. It means that people who are elected should, throughout their term of office, be required to provide an account, hence accountability, a description of what they have done, and an explanation of why they've done it, how well they think they've done, why they haven't delivered certain things that they said they would deliver, what challenges, what successes they've had. And there should be some kind of mechanism, perhaps within the legislature, also involving the media, involving committees, other public bodies, whereby those who hold power can actually be cross-questioned, be interrogated on what they've done, why they've done it, what they might have done differently, where they think they've been successful, where they think they haven't been successful, so that this process, which has to take place as far as possible in public, gives an open account of what's going on, how those who have been elected are actually performing, and it gives voters a chance to make up their mind about how they might like to vote next time. On a basis of all this accountability, are they going to vote for that person again if they voted for them before? Are they going to vote for somebody else? What decision they're going to make? But this whole wide process of political accountability is another crucial feature of this broader context of democracy. It's not entirely separate from the election process. It's not a different version of democracy to the election process. It's an example of how democracy in a wider sense feeds into this crucial central feature of the election. Thank you.